Good morning. The 55th GST Council meeting has announced a retrospective amendment with respect to Section 17(5)(d), the usage of the phrase plant or machinery, and how GST Council announces that this retrospective amendment will be applicable to change the clause of plant or machinery to be read as plant and machinery. So, what are the implications? Would it mean that the decision of the Supreme Court in case of safari retreats and others versus Union of India and others is no longer a valid application as far as the functionality test and essentiality test are concerned? Would these amendments in a way intend or will completely overrule the decision of the Supreme Court? And is there a need to panic? I have received lot of messages, lot of questions from the readers all across and from the viewers all across, because suddenly there appears to be a panic button with this announcement being made yesterday in the 55th GST Council meet. Now, let us take a pause and go back to the decision of the Supreme Court in safari retreats and just see some of these aspects one after the other. So, let me first go to the summary of the Supreme Court decision in case of safari and how in paragraph 65 Supreme Court summarizes, and this is very important. The challenge to the constitutional validity of clause C and D of section 17(5) and 16(4) of the CGST Act is not established. So, as far as the revenue is concerned, the court had very clearly said that as far as the constitutional validity is concerned, these are constitutionally valid, and hence there will be more now responsibility on the tax authorities and on the taxpayers in terms of certain guidelines and tests which were laid down. The Supreme Court in paragraph B very categorically said that the expression plant or machinery used in section 17(5)(d) cannot be given the same meaning as the expression plant and machinery defined by the explanation to section 17. Now, this part of the conclusion of the Supreme Court now gets impacted because the retrospective amendment would mean that the words which are used, plant or machinery, will be replaced by the phrase plant and machinery. So, will it completely defeat the Supreme Court decision? I am not saying that, and I'm not suggesting that also, because Supreme Court decisions has laid down various broad parameters in benefit of industry, and those shall prevail. We are not for a moment even talking about the challenge to the retrospective amendment. The retrospective amendment will also have to go through the constitutional challenge at some stage. We will come and cover that portion in a while. But now let's go and see what were the other points in the summary. The next point of the Supreme Court was the question whether a mall, warehouse, or any building other than a hotel or a cinema theater can be classified as a plant within the meaning of the expression plant or machinery used in section 17(5)(d) is a factual question. Now, this is a factual question, and this will remain a factual question because whether it will be classified as a plant. So there will be now several categories of taxpayers: those who are covered with the petitions which were there before the Supreme Court, those petitioners who were there in several other courts but not in the Supreme Court, and those classes of taxpayers who were not in any of these petitions. The facts will determine in each of these cases what needs to be done and what aspects needs to be seen, how scientifically they can still avail the credits. But as far as this aspect is concerned, which was laid down by the Supreme Court in paragraph 65C of the order, it very clearly says hotel or a cinema theater can be classified as a plant within the meaning of the expression plant or machinery. And this is a factual question which has to be determined keeping in mind the business of the registered person and the role that building plays in the said premises. If the construction of building was essential for carrying out the activity of supplying services such as renting or giving on lease or other transactions in respect of the buildings or part thereof, which are covered under clauses 2 and 5 of Schedule 2 of the CGST Act, the building could be held to be a plant. Now, the challenge will be with this retrospective amendment, uh, the test will be more stringent. The test will have to now be seen in light of the explanation and in the phrase, in the explanation which is used, you may not fall in that category, and hence the life will become tough to justify this. But it doesn't stop. The life doesn't stop here. And why we are saying so is that still it remains a factual question whether it qualifies as a plant, and now the phrase changes with retrospective amendment. So, essentiality test with respect to plant, whether that will remain a valid question, we will have to see. Uh, but yes, now let's go to the functionality test and how the court had addressed. Then it is taken out of the exception carved out by clause D of section 17(5) to section subsection 1 of section 16. Functionality test, and this is what Supreme Court had held in paragraph 65. Functionality test will have to be applied to decide whether a building is a plant. Now, the difficulty will be that both the essentiality test and the functionality test, which were laid down with respect to the element of plant, now that gets amended because now the phrase which is being used is plant and machinery. But that does not still mean that you would not get the benefit. The holistic provisions will have to be seen, and based on facts, circumstances, timing, what litigation is happening, still credit can be allowed, provided very systematic and scientific approach is taken now by the taxpayers. So, how the Supreme Court had concluded? Therefore, by using the functionality test in each case, so Supreme Court had said that each of this case will have to undergo the essentiality test and the functionality test on facts. Remember, Supreme Court had very categorically emphasized on facts in light of what we have held earlier. It will have to be decided whether the construction of an immovable property is a plant for the purposes of clause D of section 17(5). So predominantly the Supreme Court findings with respect to plant or machinery and whether it would fall within the definition of plant would have an impact on section 17(5)(d), and whether this retrospective amendment which is being made or being proposed to be made by the GST Council will have a retroactive effect on the credits which I have taken, and for that we will have to then see the constitutional validity even with respect to the even with respect to the retrospective amendment. Now let's go a little further and how Supreme Court had concluded. Let's just see that aspect also. So Supreme Court had allowed these appeals, partly allowed these appeals in terms of the above terms, and what had said while deciding these cases. Now, please note that the phrase which is used here is these cases. So the situation of the petitioners before the court and those petitioners which were not in this batch will be slightly different. Those petitioners which were never there before the court, their situation will be different. The approach will have to be different. So 67 paragraph says, while deciding these cases, we cannot make any final adjudication on the question of whether the construction of an immovable property carried out by the petitioners in petitions amounts to plant. And each case will have to be decided on its merits by applying the functionality test in terms of this judgment. Now, even if this retrospective amendment has come, it appears that And as far as the retrospective amendment was concerned, even if you see our previous videos, we had addressed this issue of retrospective amendment, and we were also anticipating that some sort of an amendment could come. However, we were not anticipating that such an amendment would be in the retrospective form, which will make, in fact, retroactive application of these provisions. That is basically was not expected, but now that has happened. And now what we have to see is that in terms of paragraph 67, while deciding these cases, so one, what happens to those cases which were before the Supreme Court? The Supreme Court had said that each case will have to be decided on its merit by applying the functionality test in terms of this judgment. As we speak, this decision is a valid decision, even if there are retrospective or retroactive amendments proposed by the GST Council. The revenue is expected to file a review in these cases, so that these cases which were addressed and for which the court had basically asked for application of this essentiality test and functionality test, and court had held that each case will have to be decided on its merit by applying the functionality test in terms of this judgment. This part of the court's judgment would not go in vain altogether. It will remain. The revenue will now have to file review as far as these petitioners are concerned, as far as these cases are concerned. And the moment the revenue files review, their retrospective amendment comes to the constitutional test automatically. Please remember that as far as retrospective amendments are concerned, retrospective amendments and several courts, including the decision in the case of Vodafone, the Supreme Court had laid down certain broad principles for retrospective amendment. Retrospective amendment should not happen in a normal course of the amendments. These amendments must happen in the rarest of rare cases, which means that only in the rarest of cases these retrospective amendment must happen. The courts have also held that these retrospective amendments must not defeat any judgment of the Supreme Court. So if the court has already passed any judgment, to address or negate that judgment, if the retrospective amendment is carried on, then retrospective amendment is not a constitutionally valid amendment, and such an amendment will have to cross the constitutional validity, courts have held. Courts have also held that a balance sometimes needs to be maintained if there is an anomaly between the provisions because of which it leads to weird uh, result, or the intention of the legislature is defeated. Then in those cases retrospective amendments must happen, but any retrospective amendment which happens must be seen in light of the retroactive impact which it will create. And I think on that last part, even if we see the announcements or the press note by the GST Council, they're trying to address this last part where they're saying that to meet the intention of the legislation, this phrase plant or machinery will now be replaced with plant and machinery. So we'll come to that in a while, but this is how we would summarize this. Now, let us go to plant or machinery and how Supreme Court had addressed this plant or machinery, plant and machinery. And it is important to see paragraph 34 of the judgment, where the court says that clause C uses the expression plant and machinery, which is specifically defined in the explanation. Clause D uses an expression plant or machinery, which is not specifically defined. So this was very well argued before the Supreme Court that plant or machinery was not specifically defined, and hence what treatment should be given to clause 17.5D, and how this amendment, retrospective amendment, addresses that is that to a very large extent, this part of the Supreme Court order gets impacted, where they had created a clear distinction between the terms plant and machinery and plant or machinery. Supreme Court in paragraph 35 says that the explanation defines the meaning of the expression plant and machinery. However, the expression plant or machinery has not been defined under the CGST Act. And then various cases, etc., were quoted. Now, let's go to paragraph 42, where detailed findings were provided with respect to the expression plant or machinery in clause D of section 17(5). Paragraph 44 says that the explanation to section 17 defines plant and machinery. The explanation seeks to define the expression plant and machinery used in chapter 5 and chapter 6. In chapter 6, the expression plant and machinery appears in several places, but the expression plant or machinery is found only in section 17(5)(d). And basis the findings in paragraph 44 of the judgment, this GST Council, 55th GST Council, has proposed these changes from retrospective effect, with retrospective effect, so as to address this part of the judgment. Now, it doesn't end here. Now, if we go to the subsequent lines in paragraph 44, what court had uh, found out was, if the legislature intended to give the expression plant or machinery the same meaning as plant and machinery as defined in the explanation, the legislature would not have specifically used the expression plant or machinery in section 17(5)(d). The legislature had made this distinction consciously. Now, here the conflict comes in, because the GST Council meeting, when it provides for this retrospective amendment, it says that the intention of the legislature was something else, whereas the court has already held in paragraph 44 of the decision that the legislature has made this distinction consciously. There's Now there is a conflict between the findings of the Supreme Court and what has been changed now retrospectively, giving a retroactive effect. And hence, it becomes important now that the retrospective amendment will have to cross the constitutionality test in terms of the findings of the Supreme Court in paragraph 44, which wherein the Supreme Court had very, very clearly, and I will repeat, this is the golden line for us, the legislature has made this distinction consciously. If the court had already held that the legislature had made this distinction consciously, how can the legislature now make an amendment, and that too retrospectively, when the court has already held that the legislature has made this distinction consciously? It doesn't end there. In fact, entire paragraph 44 is very important. And how basis this distinction made consciously, the court proceeds. The court proceeded by saying, therefore the expression plant and machinery and plant or machinery cannot be given the same meaning. Now there is a retrospective amendment, whereas the court has already held that these cannot be given the same meaning. It may also be noted here that the expression plant or machinery is used in dealing with a peculiar case of goods or services being received by a taxable person for the construction of an immovable property on his own account, even when such goods or services or both are used in the course or furtherance of business. So that test will also have to be cleared by the taxpayers. And once the tax authorities are not able to justify the completeness of section 17(5)(d) and its applicability on the taxpayers will still be able to claim these credits. Yes, the functionality test, the essentiality test, the robustness of the preparation and submissions will remain a key based on how it is presented before the tax authorities. Now, let's see how what court says further. It may also be noted here that the expression plant or machinery is used in dealing with a peculiar case of goods or services being received by a taxable person for the construction of a movable property on his own account, even when such goods or services or both are used in the course or furtherance of business. Therefore, if the expression plant or machinery is given the same meaning as the expression plant and machinery as per the definition contained in the explanation to section 17, we will be doing violence to the terms used in the statute. Now, two golden lines for us in paragraph 44, the earlier which I mentioned. The legislature has made this distinction consciously. This is the first golden line. The second golden line is we will be doing violence to the words used in the statute. The Supreme Court has used these two golden lines in favor of the taxpayers, where this distinction was created. Now, if the Supreme Court says that we will be doing violence to the words used in the statute, can today the retrospective amendment can happen just to defeat these golden lines of the judgment of the Supreme Court in Safari case? And hence, the court said that while interpreting taxing statutes, it is not the function of the court to supply the deficiencies. So, two golden lines will remain very, very important. And let's see how Supreme Court concluded this aspect in paragraph 46. The court held that the expression plant or machinery has a different connotation. It can be either a plant or machinery. Section 17(5)(d) deals with the construction of an immovable property. The very fact that the expression immovable property other than plant or machinery is used shows that there could be a plant that is an immovable property. As the word plant has not been defined under the CGST Act or the rules framed thereunder, its ordinary meaning in commercial terms will have to be attached to it. So, this conclusion, based on the two golden lines which I mentioned in paragraph 14, will be now the real test while either challenging the constitutional validity of the retrospective uh, changes which have amendments which have been proposed, or when these matters go for the essentiality test and the functionality test. So let me again tell you, there's nothing to panic as of now. The provisions for several situations are in still favor of the taxpayers, where they can avail the credit based on these findings of the Supreme Court, based on some new challenges which we may have to make, or basis the robust documentation which will have to be provided for functionality test and the essentiality test. We have already spoken about the retrospective amendment, and I would not go to that retrospective amendment as again, but those golden principles in Vodafone and several other decisions will come into play to challenge the retrospective and the retroactive amendments which have been proposed in this case. Now, last but not the least, we must understand that while the expression plant or machinery and plant and machinery now gets resolved, the credit under section 17(5)(d) gets blocked only when all elements of it are addressed. And hence, it will be now the responsibility of the taxpayers to ensure that in terms of the functionality test, essentiality test, all of these are addressed. Because, for example, the phrase on own account, what happens to on own account? The court has also addressed this own account aspect, and each of these elements will now become very, very important. The taxpayers will have to determine that what happens in different situations, what are the facts, essentiality, functionality, court orders, status of the show cause, the reply, and things like that. Whether this retrospective amendment will have a 100% impact on them because they would only fall within the definition of plant. What happens to works contract services, whether the works contract services would be covered under clause C, or whether there could be elements of certain supplies which could still fall under section 17(5)(d), keeping in mind various other parameters, even if the phrase is changed from plant or machinery to plant and machinery. What happens to those credits which were taken prior to this proposed amendment, and what happens to those credits which will be availed by us later? So there will be a need now for the taxpayers to do robust documentation, to provide robust submissions. The best thing is not to panic, analyze your facts, understand your facts, jot down your facts, reach to the professionals with whom you've been interacting, let them provide you the guidance and support to see that how still the tests are made, what are the findings which were there of the Supreme Court, how you could help with respect to those findings which are already there. As we speak, the review has not been done of this Supreme Court order. If this goes into review, there are higher chances that the retrospective amendment test of constitutionality will also come into play at some stage. So, uh, the documentation is important, and what is suggested is that please intimate the tax authorities of what you're doing. Please prepare robust documentation so as to ensure that at no point of time there is a case of non-cooperation. At no stage there are some coercive measures which could be taken by the tax authorities. With that note, I wish you a very good Sunday. Enjoy. Keep watching our YouTube channel for regular updates on these important issues. It is our endeavor to provide knowledge free of cost to all of you on all of these important aspects. Please do not uh, forget to subscribe to this YouTube channel so that you get regular updates. Do like the video if the articulation of the issues was good. Have a great day ahead.